the Vatican fell silent. Leaders across the globe issued statements of grief, but Kate Middleton remained quiet. No speech, no tribute, nothing. For days, her silence sparked questions until, finally, she spoke. And when she did, it wasn't the formality of royalty people heard, but something far more personal. Her words carried no politics, no pretense, just quiet reverence for a man whose values had touched her in ways the world never knew. Her tribute didn't just join the global mourning, it deepened it. Calm, clear, and deeply human, it left millions stunned. But to truly understand why it mattered, we have to go back to the final days of the Pope and the silent storm that followed. April 21st, 2025. The news hit like thunder across a silent sky. At precisely 7:35 a.m., in the quiet halls of Domus Santa Marta, Pope Francis took his final breath. He was 88. The official statement read, stroke, heart failure, complications from pneumonia, and high blood pressure. But no press release could soften the blow. As the Vatican confirmed his passing, the world responded not with outrage or panic, but with silence, sorrow, and disbelief. Church bells tolled across continents, from the streets of Buenos Aires to the hills of Rome, from the temples of India to cathedrals in France. Flags fell to half-staff. Candles flickered in doorways. Rosaries gripped tighter in hand. Millions gathered not for protest, but for prayer. In Argentina, his homeland, crowds flooded the streets in hushed mourning. Vigils erupted without a word from officials. In St. Peter's Square, a sea of humanity formed within hours. People wept, not just for a pope, but for the only global voice many had trusted in an age of chaos. Tributes surged in from every corner of the globe. U.S. President Joe Biden called him a moral giant. French President Emmanuel Macron praised his strength and humility. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi described him as a light for the voiceless, and Kenya's William Ruto called him a shepherd who walked among the lost. Even the Itadihitran, Dalai Lama, with quiet reverence, said the Pope's heart transcended belief. These were not just obligatory condolences, they were admissions that this one man, dressed not in gold, but in simplicity, had held the fractured world together by a thread of compassion. It wasn't politics that connected him to presidents or princes, it was pain. He spoke it fluently, and he bore it with dignity. That's what made this loss different. This wasn't just a spiritual leader. This was the global conscience. And now, it was gone. But Pope Francis hadn't left chaos in his wake. No elaborate instructions, no royal fanfare, just a wish for simplicity. He had personally requested that his funeral defy centuries of tradition. No towering tomb, no embroidered vestments, just a basic coffin, a small procession, and his papal name etched in Latin, Franciscus. The burial would not take place in the grand papal crypt beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Instead, he chose the Basilica of St. Mary Major, a modest sanctuary where generations of forgotten faithful had once prayed. A symbolic move that left cardinals stunned and traditionalists silent. His grave would be near the image of the Virgin Mary, a final gesture to humility over history. 9 days of mourning novendiales began immediately. His body, on display at St. Peter's Basilica, drew pilgrims in numbers not seen since the death of Pope John Paul II. But this was different. There were no thunderous chants, no parades, only quiet. The kind of silence that says more than applause ever could. The images were unforgettable. Mothers holding children on their shoulders to glimpse his casket. Refugees leaving handwritten notes at the gate. Teenagers sobbing quietly, with candles between their shoes. He had lived without spectacle, and he was being remembered without it too. Live streams of the procession broke viewership records. But the focus wasn't on ceremony, it was on character. His values had outlived his breath. In every country, in every faith, the question echoed. How had a man with no army, no wealth, no kingdom, become the most trusted soul on earth? And why did it feel like the last light in the room had just gone out? Pope Francis had changed the papacy not through decrees, but through decency. And now, in death, even that was speaking louder than gold. Yet as the world watched the funeral unfold and the bells continued to toll, something else was happening. Quietly, out of sight, a connection was stirring, unspoken, unseen, between the Vatican's loss and a royal silence thousands of miles away. Because while the world mourned publicly, a quieter bond was forming behind palace walls. He refused the palace. He cooked his own meals. And while the world expected robes, rituals, and reverence, he gave them sandals, silence, and truth. Jorge Mario Bergoglio didn't rise through the church to claim power. He walked among the forgotten, often invisible to the men who wore crowns and cassocks. Born in a working-class neighborhood of Buenos Aires, he learned sacrifice before scripture. The son of immigrants, raised in a cramped home filled with faith and hardship, he knew early that leadership wasn't about control, it was about care. Long before the world knew his name, Jorge was a man who chose others before himself. When his peers sought prestige, he took vows with the Jesuits, a radical path grounded in humility, service, and relentless honesty. It wasn't ambition that led him forward. It was conviction, and that quiet fire carried him through decades of hardship, silence, and service. Even when he became Archbishop of Buenos Aires, nothing changed. He didn't upgrade his life. He rejected the bishop's mansion, opting instead for a small apartment. No driver, no limousine. He took the bus like everyone else. He prepared his own meals. He walked the streets alone until the day came when history called, and the world would no longer allow him to walk quietly. In 2013, as Pope Benedict stunned the Catholic world with his resignation, the first in nearly 600 years, a new conclave gathered behind locked doors. The Vatican was ready to choose a safe name, a traditional figure, someone molded from centuries of papal expectation. But instead, white smoke rose for a man the world wasn't prepared for. Jorge Mario Bergoglio emerged not as Jorge, but as Pope Francis, and nothing was ever the same. He didn't take the golden ring or the papal apartment. He stayed at Domus Santa Marta, a guest house inside the Vatican walls. His message was immediate and unmistakable. This was not a reign, it was a mission. He spoke softly, but every word felt like thunder. He denounced greed, championed justice, and called out corruption not just in governments, but within his own church. He refused to let tradition silence truth. In his first Holy Week, he did the unthinkable. Instead of washing the feet of bishops, he went to a prison. There, he washed the feet of Muslim women prisoners, breaking centuries of rigid formality with a single act of radical grace. But it wasn't just symbolism. He followed with action. He opened the Vatican archives on sexual abuse, exposing what many had fought to hide. He met with survivors, listened without defensiveness, and vowed to break the silence that had protected predators. And he meant it. Pope Francis became the first global religious leader to speak bluntly about climate change, calling Earth not a resource, but a sacred inheritance. He demanded that the Church stop obsessing over rules and start embracing humanity. He embraced LGBTQ+ individuals with empathy instead of dogma. He shattered centuries of expectations not by rebellion, but by revelation. His power wasn't in what he changed, it was in what he refused to ignore. He wore the white robes, yes, but he walked like a man still in priest's shoes. His teachings weren't just for Catholics. They were for anyone who had ever felt forgotten, excluded, or silenced. Every speech, every gesture was a sermon on compassion, not control. And yet, what made him dangerous to tradition was exactly what made him sacred to the world. But Francis wasn't just reshaping the Church, he was building a spiritual bridge across centuries of royal divide. For 5 centuries, the line between Rome and the British crown was drawn in ink, blood, and silence. The Reformation had torn apart the spiritual bond that once linked the papacy to the English throne, replacing unity with distrust and centuries of cold formality. For generations, popes and monarchs existed on opposite sides of a divide carved by politics, pride, and power. While titles changed and leaders passed, the distance remained an ocean of ideology no one dared cross. But Francis, he didn't wait for permission. He walked across, not with grand declarations, but with something far more subversive: humility. In 2014, barely a year into his papacy, Pope Francis met Queen Elizabeth II at the Vatican. It wasn't a diplomatic spectacle. There were no photographers crowding the moment. It was private, sincere, and deeply symbolic. The oldest monarchy in Europe met the most radical pope in modern history, and something shifted. Not in words, but in the way they looked at each other. Not as rivals, not as rulers, but as human beings who had carried the weight of the world for far too long. Their meeting didn't produce a treaty or a headline. It didn't need to. What it sparked was a quiet thaw between two ancient powers, driven not by obligation, but mutual understanding. Francis and Elizabeth shared a commitment that defied protocol. Faith over formality, service over spectacle. The Pope didn't address her as a sovereign to be flattered, and the Queen didn't bow to papal prestige. Instead, they spoke of people, of duty, of the burden that comes with being a symbol to millions, and the solitude no crown or robe can protect you from. In those few short moments, centuries of distance began to dissolve. They didn't discuss their historical feud, they simply chose not to repeat it. And when Queen Elizabeth II passed in 2022, Pope Francis didn't need to attend her funeral to make an impact. His written tribute was personal, unfiltered, and global. He called her a woman of unwavering moral clarity, a servant to her people, and a bridge between faiths in her own right. His message wasn't just a farewell, it was an embrace. One monarch to another, one soul to another. It echoed through cathedrals and palaces alike, not as a diplomatic nicety, but as a recognition of something far deeper. The war had ended, and the respect was real. Then came Charles, a king shaped by nature, spirituality, and a lifelong devotion. To the earth, his rise brought with it a new dynamic, one that Pope Francis recognized instantly. Charles, long before his reign, had spoken about climate change, poverty, and the moral obligation to protect creation. These weren't topics the crown had historically embraced, but now they were central to both the king and the Pope. Without fanfare, their visions aligned. Their messages, though delivered from different platforms, began to echo each other. And every time they met, whether through messages, events, or shared causes, there was no competition for reverence, only conviction. Francis admired Charles's quiet resolve, his moral clarity, and Charles saw in Francis not just a religious figure, but a kindred spirit, who led not from above, but among. But it wasn't Charles or the Queen who felt the deepest bond. It was someone watching silently from the side. She never spoke of it in public. There were no interviews, no carefully worded statements. But behind the palace walls, the Princess of Wales carried something deeper than diplomacy, a quiet reverence for the Pope who had never worn a crown, but led like a king. Kate Middleton, raised in the traditions of the Anglican Church, had never been seen aligning with Catholic doctrine. And yet, the man in white living humbly within the Vatican stirred something within her. It wasn't about religion, it was about values. And from the earliest days of his papacy, Pope Francis represented everything Kate believed leadership should be: humble, compassionate, real. While others praised his political neutrality or doctrinal reforms, Kate saw something else: his unwavering focus on people, on children, on dignity. In a world filled with noise, he led with silence and substance. And she noticed their connection wasn't forged through headlines or state visits. It unfolded slowly, quietly, like a conversation without words. Behind the cameras, she had rosaries blessed in Rome and kept close. Books filled with the Pope's twitwing. Teachings on mercy, on justice, on empathy made their way into her personal collection, not as gifts for show, but as guidance. These weren't just mementos. They were reflections of shared belief. Kate, whose royal duties had long drawn her into causes surrounding early childhood development, mental health, and marginalized communities, found her own mission mirrored in his. The man who once knelt before prisoners and washed their feet was the same man who inspired her silent resolve to kneel beside grieving mothers and troubled children across the UK. They had never posed for a photograph together, yet the alignment was undeniable. When Kate attended interfaith events, quiet gatherings unpublicized by tabloids, Those close to her noticed something striking. When Pope Francis's messages were read aloud or referenced in speeches, she listened differently. She didn't smile for optics or applaud politely. She absorbed, often nodding, visibly moved, but never commenting. It wasn't just respect, it was recognition. He was speaking the same language she had chosen to live by. Compassion without condition. And while others looked for power in bold declarations, she understood the greater power in restraint. Her admiration for him didn't come from obligation. It came from resonance. The kind that doesn't require public acknowledgement to be real. Palace aides, rarely prone to exaggeration, spoke of moments where Kate would reference his words in private meetings, quoting his belief that a little bit of mercy makes the world less cold and more just. Not as a political echo, but as a quiet call to action. She admired not only his sermons, but his silences. Not only his reforms, but his refusal to bend to extravagance. He reminded her of the purpose behind the privilege, of why titles meant nothing if they weren't used to protect those with none. In him, she didn't see a religious authority. She saw a servant leader, one who reminded her daily that kindness was still a force greater than control. But admiration became something deeper, especially when they both worked on the same cause: children. He embraced homeless children in the Eider slums of Manila. She knelt beside grieving mothers in the heart of London. They never met in person. But Pope Francis and Kate Middleton were bound by something deeper than proximity, a mission, a shared, unwavering belief that the youngest, the most fragile, and the most voiceless among us deserved not pity, but power. While the world watched them from opposite ends of tradition, one draped in papal white, the other wrapped in royal duty, they were walking the same path, step by step. In refugee camps, in orphanages, in war-torn cities, and underfunded schools, Francis made it his life's work to protect children discarded by a world too busy to care. He hugged them, fed them, sat beside them in silence when words would only fail. He didn't lead from behind the walls of the Vatican. He went to the margins, where children bled and cried and waited. And he didn't go to preach. He went to listen. And Kate, though born into a world of gowns, crowns, and ceremonial order, did the same. But her platform was different. It wasn't built on doctrine. It was built on empathy. Through her work with early childhood development, mental health, and support systems for struggling families, she stepped into homes and hospitals with a quiet urgency. She didn't come with answers. She came with open arms. Again and again, she spoke of a world where children's emotional security should come before academic performance or social class. She believed in dignity, not statistics. And as she met with experts and educators, traveled to shelters and schools, her words echoed a message that Pope Francis had spent years whispering across continents. If we lose the child, we lose everything. They were never seen in a room together, but they spoke the same language. Time and again, Kate referenced values that mirrored his teachings, calling for kindness, protection, and the acknowledgement that childhood trauma, if ignored, would cost society more than any economic crisis. These weren't borrowed beliefs. They were deeply held convictions, shaped by different lives, but rooted in the same truth. Children are not political tools. They are not burdens. They are the sacred pulse of a future worth saving. And in a world driven by image, both Francis and Kate chose substance. Their compassion was never performative. It wasn't curated for headlines or orchestrated for applause. It was lived. In the Pope's tearful encounters with orphaned migrants, in Kate's quiet moments with children who had lost parents to addiction or violence. These were not scripted scenes. They were the result of a calling neither had asked for, but both had embraced. Because they knew something many in power still refused to learn, that empathy isn't weakness, it's strength in its purest form. They carried it not like a brand, but like a burden, a sacred one. And even as they came from institutions defined by tradition, they broke that mold from within. Not with rebellion, but with relentless kindness. Their shared mission was not about religion or royalty, it was about humanity. And when the Pope passed, Kate's tribute wasn't scripted. It was the outpouring of years of quiet respect. It wasn't just a tribute, it was a revelation of the soul. Days after Pope Francis's death, when global leaders had long since released their condolences and the headlines had already begun to shift, something unexpected appeared on the official royal platforms. A message. Not from the king, not from the church, but from Catherine, Princess of Wales. No titles, no fanfare. Just her words, and the world stopped to read them. It wasn't political, it wasn't scripted, it was personal. It came from somewhere deeper than duty. Her tribute didn't speak of ceremony or statecraft. It spoke of loss, of legacy, of a man whose power came not from his office, but from the purity of his intention. She called him a symbol of peace in a fractured world. And for the first time in days, the noise of grief turned into stillness. She didn't write about Vatican politics or papal history. Instead, she pointed to the one thing that had always bound them: his love for children, for the displaced, for the overlooked. She wrote about the way he walked with humility, spoke without judgment, and acted without hesitation. She spoke of his unwavering devotion to giving dignity to those who had none. And she thanked him not as a member of the royal family, but as a woman who had watched quietly, learned deeply, and been moved beyond words. Her message was a mirror, reflecting back everything Pope Francis had given to the world. But this time, it came from a palace that had once seemed so far from Rome, and that made it all the more powerful. The tribute spread faster than the official announcements from Buckingham Palace or Downing Street. News outlets picked it up, not because of who said it, but because of how it was said. It didn't feel like a press release. It felt like a confession, a message carved out of quiet reverence, unshaken admiration, and a sorrow that ran deep. Social media lit up. Religious leaders, from Catholic bishops to Islamic scholars, quoted her words. Human rights organizations shared the tribute on their pages. Teachers, parents, refugee workers. The people Pope Francis had served most closely now saw their loss echoed in the words of a future queen. Somehow, in a few short lines, Kate had captured what most governments and institutions could not. That the Pope's death wasn't just the loss of a religious figure, it was the end of a light in a dark time. But the most haunting part of her message wasn't in how it looked back, it was how it looked forward. In her closing words, she spoke of the responsibility to carry the work forward, not as an obligation, but as a promise. It was subtle, but it wasn't accidental, because, while most were mourning what had been lost, Kate was already thinking of what must come next. And those final words hinted at something far more powerful. Kate didn't just mourn the Pope. She made a vow to carry his torch. Her tribute may have been rooted in grief, but its final message burned with purpose. She wasn't just saying goodbye. She was issuing a challenge, a quiet, resolute call to reshape how the world defines leadership, faith, and service. In the wake of Pope Francis's death, when the world risked slipping back into its old habits of division and silence, Kate stepped forward with a vision that reached far beyond Windsor and Vatican walls. She called on faith leaders to do more than recite tradition. She called on world leaders to do more than govern. She urged them all to lead with something that had grown dangerously rare: compassion. In a fractured world, she dared to imagine unity. Not the kind born from treaties or political alignments, but the kind built on shared humanity. She spoke of faith not as a doctrine to debate, but as a bridge to cross. A force that could bind nations, not separate them. In her eyes, Pope Francis had already laid that foundation. Now it was time to build. And she made it clear. His passing should not be an end, but a beginning. A call to serve not just the faithful, but the forgotten. She urged leaders to stop hiding behind protocol and start reaching for the people who needed them most. Refugees, children, the sick, the voiceless. The Pope had stood for them. Now she would too. Her words were not about symbolism, they were about substance. She wasn't asking for ceremonies, she was demanding action, and people listened. Because when Kate spoke of unity, she didn't sound like someone protecting a legacy. She sounded like someone ready to fight for a future. She called for interfaith collaboration not as a formality, but as a lifeline, an opportunity to heal wounds generations deep. She encouraged alliances between royal institutions, churches, mosques, temples, and secular movements, a new model of leadership, shaped by empathy, not ego. Not just prayers for peace, but policies born from compassion. Not just charity events, but sustained outreach. She made space for voices that had never stepped inside a palace. She opened the door for dialogue where silence had lived for too long. And as she laid out this vision, it became clear Kate was no longer the silent observer watching from the edges. In the absence of Pope Francis, she was stepping into the space he once filled, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. A different voice, carrying the same message. She wasn't wearing robes or offering blessings, but in every word, she honored the heart of what he stood for. That kindness is not weakness. That dignity is not a gift, but a right. That legacy is not what we leave behind, but what we choose to carry forward. In her silence, Kate had been listening. In her words, she had become a voice for something bigger. He left no gold, no crown, no grand tomb. Yet the world will remember him longer than kings. When Pope Francis passed, he didn't leave behind a palace filled with treasures or a title soaked in centuries of conquest. He left behind a legacy written in humility, carried on the shoulders of the forgotten, and echoed in the hearts of those he touched. His power didn't come from robes or rituals. It came from the way he lived, from the way he listened, from the way he chose silence over spectacle and service over ceremony. In a world obsessed with image, Francis quietly carved his name into history by refusing the very things most leaders chase. No towering monument could match the weight of the path he walked. And Kate Middleton knew that. In her tribute, she didn't just recall the Pope's deeds, she elevated them. She placed them beside the monarchy's own evolving story. And in doing so, she did something few expected. She reshaped the narrative of what leadership looks like in the 21st century. Her message wasn't political, it wasn't religious, it was deeply human. It reminded the world that leadership isn't found in the size of your following, but in the depth of your compassion. That influence isn't measured in titles, but in the quiet choices made when no one is watching. She didn't speak of doctrine or power structures. She spoke of service, of grace, of lives changed because one man dared to do things differently. And the world listened. From Vatican City to the streets of Delhi, from Buenos Aires to Birmingham, her words struck a chord that hadn't been touched by diplomacy in decades. Religious scholars praised the tribute. Educators quoted it. Activists used it to rally. It wasn't just a royal acknowledging a pope. It was a moment of spiritual diplomacy that may very well shape the tone of future royal engagements. In that one message, Catherine bridged not just faiths, but expectations. She took the centuries-old weight of monarchy and aligned it with a message of modesty and action, showing the world that royalty need not be distant and that holiness need not be grand. And as the world begins to move forward, something lingers, a shift, a feeling that perhaps something new has begun. Francis may be gone, but the humility he championed, the dignity he restored to the voiceless, now lives on in unexpected places. In the halls of Windsor, in the voices of children, in the quiet strength of a princess who chose to carry that flame. His legacy isn't carved into stone, it's etched into hearts. And as the final prayers fade and new headlines rise, what remains is not the grandeur of a papacy, but the simplicity of its truth. True greatness is found in service. True remembrance is earned, not inherited. And true leadership leaves behind no statue, only footsteps worth following. And as the world turns the page, it does so with his message alive and her voice echoing it louder than ever. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.